So it's my pleasure to introduce Marty White today. He will be speaking on the topic of China's population decline. Marty's official title is the John Lonstra Professor of International Studies and Sociology Emeritus at Harvard University. He spent much of his career, though, at the University of Michigan, where he trained several generations of China specialists in sociology, poli-sci, history, including some are in this room that he mentored when he was there. And then he followed me to GW.
Much mentoring.
Most people bring their students with them when they come, they change schools. I brought Marty with me. So he was here for about
6 years.
6 years,
Yeah.
and then Harvard came calling, and he finished his career up at Harvard. Much of it, if you know his work, much of his research focused on social organization in China. The later part of his career focused on the issue of inequality, based on a series of public opinion surveys that culminated in his book on China's social volcano, or the myth of China, the myth of the social volcano. That came out from Stanford in 2010. He then had an update based upon more recent survey data that came out in China Journal last year. And his most recent book is a memorial to his mentor, Ezra Vogel, called Remembering Ezra Vogel, that he co-edited with Mary Brinton in 2022. So with that, take it away.
Thank you. It's nice to be back at GW, to be invited back, and I had the offer from Harvard when I was teaching here. Steve Trachtenberg, some of you may remember Steve Trachtenberg, called me into his office and said, "You'll regret it." It's much nicer here, but I didn't regret it, but I also don't regret the years that I spent here, which was great, including having 3 colleagues that had been Michigan students. So anyway, so I got a lot of stuff to cover today. Now, I'm assuming this will work, okay? So 2022, as most of you know, was the year in which China started population decline. After having the largest population of any country in the world for many centuries. And it's continued to decline since then. So in 2025, the decline was larger, more than 4 million people. So India has now surpassed China as the most populous country. So one question is, how did this happen? How did China go from being the largest and growing population to now beginning to shrink? And is this a good thing, an accomplishment, or is this a potential looming crisis? There are a lot of different issues, and I'd like to start by, in my view, there's still a lot of myths and misunderstandings about the history of the one-child policy and the consequences of the one-child policy. So the first part of my talk is really going to be dealing with that. And that's also where the be careful what you wish for comes in. So these are some of the things that I'd like to talk about this afternoon. And I'm not going to read these off. You can all read them. But again, looking backward, it's true today that China now has a population of 1.4 billion. It's 2.5 times, not quite 3 times as large as it was when the Chinese communists took control. But it didn't get there because Mao was an ardent enemy of any effort to control the population. The image of Mao is often as an ardent pro-natalist, but it's rather, Mao was a very wildly inconsistent guy, as you'll see in a moment. And mandatory birth limits started in China, not in 1980 with the one-child policy, but in 1970, a decade earlier when Mao was still in charge. And at least 70% of the overall reduction in the fertility rate in China that has occurred from 1970 up to 2016, when the one-child policy ended, occurred during the 1970s, before the one-child policy was even launched. So So I will be arguing and will present some evidence here that the one-child policy is not the main explanation for why China has begun to experience population decline and rather sudden decline. A lot of the things I'm going to talk about are going to be using this thing called the total fertility rate. I assume not too many people in this room are demographers, and actually I'm not trained as a demographer myself, but I hang around with them and co-author with them, so I steal their ideas. And some of the slides that you'll see, what is the total fertility rate? It's not an actual statistic, it's a statistical projection. What it is if the average woman in society, averaging women of all different ages and marital status and so forth, how many babies will she give birth to by the end of her childbearing years? And the replacement level fertility, as it's called, is 2.1. In other words, roughly, if every woman gave birth to 2 children, then eventually the population would stabilize. Okay. But China, as we'll see, had much higher fertility before the 1970s. Here's Mao's most famous statement about population, and illustrating his strong belief in the pro-natal point of view. And again, I won't read this, but it's important to look at the date at the bottom, September 1949. So this was just before the Chinese Communist Party proclaimed national liberation. And this quote is actually a response to US Secretary of State at the time, Dean Acheson. And basically, Dean Acheson said, don't worry, if the communists take over control of the mainland, they won't be able to feed the population, so they'll fail within a short period of time. And this is Mao's response. That ain't going to happen. And of course, it didn't happen. But not that many years later, this is 1957, as China was finishing its first 5-year plan, and it had recently completed socialist transformation. Mao sings a very different tune, and he has several different statements around the same time. Okay, so population needs to be planned just like material production in factories. And he often suggests maybe we need a special ministry of birth control, a commission as part of the government. And as we'll see, China did a few years later establish such an organization, which continued and was involved in the enforcement of these later policies that I'll be talking about. It's also the case that China under Mao, in some periods, did carry out voluntary family planning campaigns to try to encourage people to have fewer babies. And basically in the mid-1950s and then in the 1960s, between recovery from the Great Leap Forward and the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, there were 2 periods in which China tried to encourage people to have fewer babies. And they did it. It wasn't just propaganda. They developed their own contraceptive pill shortly after the contraceptive pill was introduced in Western societies. They developed a network for distributing contraceptives of all kinds with no cost nationwide. And that State Family Planning Commission, which has changed its name various times, but it was established in 1964 and has continued after that. But it's also the case that during the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1960, during the Cultural Revolution after 1966, voluntary family planning was neglected. There was no real organized effort. They were too busy doing other crazy things. And Mao made some other pro-natal statements during these later periods that, there's one about, it doesn't matter if the bomb explodes and 100 million Chinese, we got many more Chinese than we need or something like that. But before 1970, there was an almost perfect negative correlation between family planning encouragement by the state and how many babies people were actually having. And coercive family planning, as I mentioned, didn't begin with the one-child policy. It began in 1970 with this campaign, the Later, Longer, Fewer campaign, which began to be carried out in the early 1970s. It became overly strict later on. And the goals were to delay marriage. The legal marriage age at this time was 18 for females and 20 for males. But the party tried to get people to delay very substantially. So rural women not until 23, rural men 25, and urban women 25, and urban men 27 or 28. And they wanted to have spacing between births. That's the longer, and then fewer. At this time, there was supposed to be a mandatory limit of 2 births for urban families and 3 births for rural families. And they very vigorously enforced this and had sanctions and penalties and so forth. You were supposed to get, particularly in urban areas, birth permits. There was menstrual monitoring. There was there eventually in the one-child era came to be 500,000 state family planning grassroots enforcements, mostly middle-aged women who, among other things, they were supposed to keep track of the contraceptive usage, the birth history, and the menstrual cycles of women in the neighborhood or whatever they were enforcing. And the idea was if they checked and a woman admitted that she had missed her period, they would start around the clock haranguing her to get an abortion. And we even have during this toward the end of this period, one infamous study in a rural area in China by this guy Stephen Mosher, which some of you have heard about, who in his book has a picture of a woman in his rural area being subjected to a 3rd trimester cesarean abortion. Think about that for a minute. So you read some things that the coercion didn't begin until 1980, but it's far from the case. It was highly coercive already, but it was also highly effective. And the next chart, let me back up a minute. This is stuck in here. This is a French journalist who wrote a book of China after visiting China in the mid-1950s when that first voluntary family planning committee campaign was being carried out. And he had this very prescient statement in his book. They weren't yet doing this, but if they wanted to, he said they would be able to in fact have neighborhood street committees enforce the quotas, give advice, and keep an eye on married couples. Well, that began to happen in the 1970s already, not in the 1980s. Now this is a very important chart, and my laser pointer won't work very well, but let me point out several very important things. One is, for most, if you like, most normal times after 1949 up until 1970, the total fertility rate in China fluctuated around 6. So the average woman would, at the end of her childbearing, have 6 babies. So both, you can't really see it, can you? This period of voluntary family planning and this period of voluntary family planning, people were having a lot of babies, even though the government was trying to discourage it. The time they had very many fewer babies was during the Great Leap Forward, when there was a famine and more than 30 million people are estimated to have died of famine. But here you see 1970, the later, longer, fewer campaign. So this is the 70% reduction of total fertility compared to the end of the period. I'll show a chart later on that brings it up more to date. But it went down very sharply. The one-child policy was launched in 1980. Right after 1980, the total fertility rate actually went up for reasons that I can talk about if you want to know. But then it fluctuated. But then they began to more strictly. There was a liberalization that also occurred in 1983-84, allowing rural couples to have 1.5 babies. What that means is, instead of trying to get rural families to just have one child, if their first child was a boy, they were supposed to stop and get an IUD or get sterilized or whatever. But if the first child was a girl, they could try one more time, but then they were supposed to stop, okay? But it's during this period, the 1990s, that in fact you have lots of abandoned baby girls and adoptions overseas and so forth. The one veto policy refers to a change in enforcement in which instead of just relying on these mostly middle-aged women family planning enforcers, local party officials were held responsible for achieving low birth numbers in their localities, and they could be penalized if they didn't do that. So they started they almost overwhelmingly male local powerful officials began to much more strictly penalize people if they got pregnant and had extra babies. So if the fertility rate had already been reduced to under 3 before the end of the 1970s, not that much higher than than replacement level fertility, why was the one-child policy launched? And it's a complicated story. My Harvard colleague Susan Greenhall has done the best research on this and has published things, but basically starting in 1978 already, in 78 and 79, all of the top Chinese leaders determined that they needed to be even stricter to try to reduce the birth rate further than was already being done in the later, longer, fewer campaign, because they were worried that population would increase and would eat up, the per capita living standards and diets would be reduced. And there was another factor that if I go back to that earlier, this chart, 1963, the total fertility rate was over 7. Now, that didn't mean that many women actually went on and had 7 births, but there was a baby boom of deferred births after the recovery from the Great Leap Forward. And China was facing in the 1980s those women who were born in the baby boom years. So they decided, they declared they wanted to try to restrict China's population by the end of the century to 1.2 billion. And this was at a time when China was almost at 1 billion. And they determined that they would have to restrict families insofar as possible to 1 birth. So they ended the later, longer, fewer campaign and focused overwhelmingly on reducing fertility further to as close as they could get to 1 birth. Then into this debate, so they had already determined, the top leaders had already reached a consensus on trying to enforce a 1-child mandatory limit instead of the 2 and 3 child of the later, longer, fewer campaign. But into this debate steps Sung Jen, very important. He's not a demographer. He's a rocket scientist and cybernetrician, whatever you call it, somebody that does cybernetics. Anyway, trained in the Soviet Union, but he traveled to Europe, Western Europe, twice in the 1970s, and he met with people, including a bunch of Western researchers that were involved in a very controversial publication published in 1972 called The Limits to Growth. And these were Malthusians. That first quote from Mal quotes, if you don't know, Malthus was the father of economic demography who lived at the beginning of the 19th century, basically. And Malthus is known for saying that there's an inevitable tendency for population growth to grow geometrically while food and other, agricultural yields and so forth can only grow arithmetically. So there'll be an inevitable tendency to immiserate the population if you don't do something to control the population by making war or things like that, which some people are doing these days. Anyway, Sung Jen also, because he was a rocket scientist working in the missile defense ministry, he had access to computers, whereas most Chinese demographers, I think they graduated from abacuses to, electronic calculators, but they didn't have access to computers at this time. And he could do projections of if the average Chinese woman has 1, 1.5, 1.75, 1.2, 2.5. What will China's population be in the future? And he was able to show that if China continued at its current rate, it would grow to a very, like 4 billion people or whatever, a century later. And he essentially proclaimed that he thought the optimal population for China a century later, in other words, by 1980, was under 700 million. Well, China at the time, as I mentioned, already had almost 1 billion. So be careful what you wish for. He was actually saying China has already exceeded its optimal carrying capacity for its population, and it needs to dramatically not just stop rapid population growth, but actually reduce the population. Okay. And in my view, he had the air, he could put on the air of scientific authority and computers and so forth that other people couldn't match. And he basically hijacked much of the so-called demographer discussions of what China should do. And so on top of the China leaders had already decided to implement a one-child policy, but it might have been enforced, say, for 20 years or something to get past this baby boom from the 1960s baby boom. But Sun Jian was an ardent defender of long-term imposition of this one-child limit. And there were a variety of demographers who criticized his ideas and said this is going to be very hard to enforce. You're going to have to use a lot of coercion. There's going to be a lot of resistance. There's going to be unbalanced sex ratios and very rapid aging of the population and many other problems. And basically, the authorities said, well, those are problems we can deal with in the future. The most important thing is to rein in the population growth. This is Mr. Sun Jian. So far as I know, he's still alive, 94 years old. And I'll come back and mention him later, but he ended up being very influential. He's not the father of the one-child policy, but he provided the scientific sounding, but in my view, actual quackery, particularly this thing, what is the optimal population for China? I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, you can't do that. This is the kind of propaganda poster that in the one-child era that many of you have seen. Happy couple with one child, and of course that child is a daughter. And here is the influence outside of China. This is from a British publication, Diane Francis, who saying, well, maybe the whole world should follow China and adopt a one-child policy because we're getting too many people in the world. So what actually happened to fertility trends during the period after the one-child policy was launched nationally in September of 1980? In fact, the fertility rate increased and then fluctuated. It only began a further decline in the late 1980s. China did reach sub-replacement fertility, 2.1 by the early 1990s, and further declined after that, so that toward the end of the one-child era, the estimates of total fertility rate were in the 1.4 to 1.6 range. Does anybody know what the American total fertility rate at the moment is? 1.6. For 15 or so years ago, we were at about replacement level, but our fertility has been falling, not by this one-child policy, but for a variety of other reasons, including economic uncertainties. But the argument that I have made with my demographer colleagues is that this further decline in the total fertility rate in China during the one-child era is mainly driven by China's extraordinary rapid rate of economic development, urbanization, increasing education, particularly for women. And there have been United Nations population conferences held over the years. And back in, I think already in the 1970s, one of the slogans was, development is the best contraceptive. So rather than having specific family planning campaigns and enforcement or whatever, economic development will automatically drive down the birth rate. And of course, all other East Asian societies have achieved what's called ultra low fertility. That's total fertility rates under 1.4 without having any of this kind of very widespread coercion that China employed. Okay, so China is essentially catching up with them, but doing so initially during the 1970s by a heavy dose of coercion. So this is a United Nations World Population Progress, I think is the title of it. So it's similar to that earlier graph I showed, but it shows the end of goes out further on the right, and you'll see that China is basically in recent times has reached a total fertility rate of about 1, which is really extraordinarily low. Okay. If you compare China with other East Asian countries, the champion is South Korea. South Korea for some years has had a total fertility rate of under 0.8. But compared to Taiwan and Japan, I think Taiwan's is now also at 1 or under 1, but in 2022, it was still a little higher. But we see a lot about Japan, and they're worried about their rapid aging and the low birth rates. But Japan has a higher birth rate than China, even though Japan is a much richer country, obviously. So the ending of the one-child limit. So mandatory birth limits continued for 45 years. The last 35 years were under the one-child limit. Around 24 Chinese demographers, about half of them working in Western research institutions and universities, half of them employed in China, started having regular meetings to try to campaign to end the one-child policy. And they did pilot research and drafted memoranda to send up to the leadership. And they argued that if the one-child policy was ended, there wouldn't be a new baby boom, and massive coercion and family suffering were causing all kinds of problems. But they sent 2 appeals up through the Chinese leadership in 2004 and 2009, and Sun Jian reportedly came out of retirement. He was already retired by this time to insist that the one-child policy be maintained. But the third appeal they sent up in 2015, I guess whether he didn't come out of retirement again or he was too feeble to make his arguments, but it may have helped end it. We don't really know. So these are the policies that now we finally get to the more recent trends that you've all read about in the press in recent times. So as of January 1st, 2016, all Chinese are allowed to have 2 children. Starting in 2021, that was raised to 3 children. And they're not only allowed to, but actually encouraged to. So the government would. So there's been a 180-degree turnaround of government policy from trying very vigorously and coercively to have people have fewer babies to now trying to encourage them to have more babies. But for almost every year since 2016, the number of births in China has declined. And the lowest level in PRC history was last year. There were fewer than 8 million births in China, which is less than 50% of 2016, where you had a slight bump up after the ending of the one-child policy. So it's been a very sharp decline. And that meant that the population decline that started in 2022 has continued. And these are figures for recent years. So now I suspect China next year will declare that it is now slightly under 1.4 billion. And these are at the very bottom, the estimates of the total fertility rate in recent years for China. So 1.9, 1.03. There was a slight bump up in births in 2024, which some articles said was because it's a dragon year. So if you're going to have a baby, do it in a dragon year, not a snake year. This is my year, horse year. I'm not sure what horse years mean for births, but anyway. But then the 2025 estimate is the total fertility rate is just slightly below 1, which is really, so why is China is still a much poorer, still a developing middle range, upper middle range, middle income range country? Why is its fertility rate so low and even lower than places like Japan? And there are a variety of arguments. One is that China has become a very competitive and costly society. There's some estimates, I don't know how these are done and how credible they are, but they're claiming that compared to family income, that it costs more in China, urban China at least, to raise a child up to age 18 or high school graduation or something than it does in the United States, compared to not the total cost, but compared to family income. One Yunzhou, who is now occupying the esteemed China sociology seat at the University of Michigan, has a new manuscript, and she argues that one other contributor is that urban women who want to have jobs and careers, because now the government is allowing and encouraging people to have babies, and they're extending maternity leaves, and they can have more babies, that employers are getting more reluctant to hire women and promote women because it's going to be. And so one argument is that women, in order to get jobs or try to get promotions, have to more or less pledge they won't have babies, or they'll only have one, or they won't take the full maternity leave that's available to them also. Another factor that's distinctive to China is the fact that rural migrants. Rural migrants constitute about 21% of the overall population. But particularly in the large cities, it's very difficult still for migrant families to get their children enrolled in urban public schools. And even if they were enrolled in urban public schools, they're generally only allowed to stay enrolled until lower middle school graduation, which is 9 years, the point at which compulsory education ends. If they want to go to upper middle school or to college, they can't continue in the public schools in the big cities where their parents may reside. So they have to go back to the rural areas and so forth. So the whole situation for this very substantial, 300 million Chinese migrant laborers is very inimical to having lots of babies. Their life, there are a lot of works now that refer to them not as China's proletariat, but precariat, to refer to just how uncertain and difficult their life is. So anyway, here's the annual birth, just a more systematic. So you can see going from the top in 2016, 17.86 million, now down under 8 million. So the Chinese Communist Party has been doing all kinds of things since 2016 to try to boost births. So in the Mao era, people who worked in state enterprises and factories, women got paid maternity leave, which is something we don't have in our society. But anyway, it was 56 days, says, 8 weeks maternity leave. Then it was lengthened to 98 days, but now there are various provinces that are experimenting with making that 2 or 3 months or whatever, longer maternity leave. There's a new system introduced just a year or so ago for parents to give birth to babies up to 3 years old. They will get a child care subsidy from the state of about the equivalent of $500 a year per child. They've extended the period of wedding leave. There's a proposal by the end of this year that out-of-pocket financial expenditures for families for hospital births will be reduced to zero by the end of this year. I haven't followed that. I don't know how well that's working. And there are various other things that I list here. This is not an exhaustive list. They're also negative. They're trying to discourage people from getting abortions unless they're medically necessary. Although I'm not sure exactly how they're discouraging. They're trying to discourage divorce in 2020. If you want to get a divorce now, there's a 30-day cooling off period you have to submit to before you can get a divorce. They've recently introduced taxes on condoms and other contraceptive devices. And there are even some accounts that sound like the 1970s of grassroots family planning workers asking women, keeping track of women's menstrual periods and asking, have you missed your period yet? Not because we want you to get an abortion, but because we hope you will miss your period so you'll get pregnant. But so far, I don't see yet signs that, major coercion is being used to try to get people to have more babies, and how that would work and whether it would work. But nonetheless, there's some people already writing about this possibility. There's changed propaganda. This is Wuhan, a sculpture on the banks of the Yangtze River in Wuhan. And of course, this happy family has 3 children of mixed genders. But so far, there's no sign that these policies are having any real effect, because as the number of births has continued to go down, it may stabilize. I don't think it can't keep going down at the rate it's going down recently, or China would end up not having any babies, but in 20 years or something. But nonetheless, it may stabilize, but it will stabilize at a very low level that doesn't get China anywhere close to replacement level fertility. So this is the conclusion that Sun Jian will eventually get his wish. Maybe he'll be dead by the time he gets his wish. But nonetheless, population is already beginning to fall, and there are various projections about by 2100 that China will be at 700 million or even less. Some people are saying, oh, maybe China will only have 350 million by 2100. So it's a very chancy thing. So so Xi Jinping, though, is adamant. He thinks we can establish a policy of marriage and childbirth culture that'll bring up the birth rate. But I don't see any prospect for this actually happening. And it's easier to compel people to have fewer babies than it is to induce them to have more. And besides, they won't grow up and enter the labor force and marry for 20 years or so. So, but is China's population decline, which has already started, is it a crisis? And there are, of course, some arguments that this is a good thing for China. And of course, Sun Jian and his colleagues said, of course, that's good. There won't be such stress on the environment. There won't be so much crowding, pollution, pressure on resources. It'll be easier to feed. Okay, but there are nonetheless very serious problems connected with how China its population is evolving in recent years, because China is more rapidly aging than any other country, even more so than Japan earlier. China is growing old before getting rich. In other words, for the most part, Chinese society still depends on families to provide care for the elderly, their elderly parents or grandparents or whatever. They're only beginning to develop, retirement homes and old age facilities and graduated care facilities and all of that. My recently deceased colleague, Bill Overholt, has this quote in one of his articles: "The Japanese experience shows what an extraordinary burden a grading society can be. China's grading problem is worse. China has had fewer people entering the labor force since about 2010. So that means there are fewer people working and paying taxes and contributing to the support of the elderly. While the number of the elderly, the proportion of the elderly is increasing dramatically. So I think in around 2020, China had about 18% of its population over age 60. It's projected by 2050 to have 40% of its population over age 60. And the issue is not simply the funding of support for the elderly, but the kind of care and tending and emotional support that that elderly people can receive from their children and grandchildren if they don't have very many. This is a cartoon from back in the one-child era that was quite familiar. This is the so-called 4-2-1 family. So, if you only have one child and the parents, so the one child will eventually have to support two parents and maybe four grandparents. And he looks a little worried, doesn't he? This is a slide stolen from my collaborator, Wang Feng, another former Wolverine. And I'm not going to go over the whole thing, but I focus on the graph on the left and the yellow line. This is the dependency ratio. So starting in the beginning of the reforms, China experienced a demographic dividend. In other words, there were more people in the labor force compared to either the elderly retired people and the young people. And that continued to improve until a decade or so ago. But now the dependency ratio is moving sharply upward. And the shape of the population pyramid is also, these other things show how by 2030, you'll have this narrow at the bottom and bulging at the top age structure. This is a chart showing the number of working age adults supporting each elderly person over age 60. And it went from close to 8 to already down to 3, and will decline further over time. Here's another feature of this decline. One normally thinks that the richer countries have older populations, but China now just recently passed the US and now has the average age of the member of the Chinese population is slightly older than America. That's what the red line going up past is. It's like 38. We're sort of stuck at 38, but they're going up towards 40. What about the social safety net to support the elderly, among other things? China's social safety net has been expanding since 2000 in very positive ways, but it's still very uneven. Particularly the most uneven is in regard to pensions, where most of the pension income goes to urban retirees and state enterprises and factories and so forth. And there is a rural pension system started, but only in 2009, and the average family doesn't get enough to live on. So in this study, again, my demographic colleagues, they published a study that said that there was less than 12% of the government spending was on education, healthcare, and pensions at the time that they were publishing this, but it would rise to 23% of GDP by 2050, even if there was no change in benefit levels. So you still had very uneven benefits with rural people not being so well cared for. But if they equalize spending for its population, then more than 32% of the whole gross domestic product would have to be spent just on these three realms of education, healthcare, and pensions. And that seems unrealistic. I did a survey, an earlier survey in China in the city of Baoding in Hebei, a sort of medium-large city south of Beijing. And it was interested in intergenerational relations. So we interviewed a random sample of people over age 50 and then one of their grown children. And at the time in 1994, the average older respondent over age 50 had 3.1 grown children, and almost all of them lived nearby. But in recent times, most in Baoding and other large cities will only have one child, and the child may not stay around, may be off working in Shenzhen or somewhere else. They're even a minority. It's estimated that if urban women that live past 80, maybe as many as 10% of them will outlive the one child that they gave birth to. So the question again is, what kind of security is there for the elderly? I argue that there's less sense of security for the elderly now than there was in 1994 in Baoding, even though Chinese are in general much richer, but nonetheless. But I actually applied for a grant to go back to Baoding, and I didn't get the grant, so I can't absolutely prove that. So I'm arguing here that China should be doing more to invest in the human capital of its existing population rather than trying to boost the birth rate. They should spend more money on the various crying needs. They should China has very bizarre early retirement ages, which I could spend a whole nother lecture. Why do they have for up until 2025, a man was supposed to retire at age 60, and a woman at age 55 if she was in a mental labor job, at age 50 if she was in a manual labor job. Why did they have these unusual ages? They copied them from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union ceased to exist a long time ago. China stopped having an alliance with the Soviet Union in 1960, but they didn't change it. So one of the problems of aging is you have people retiring much earlier and then needing support. And so the whole pension system and everything else is very difficult. There's also the fact that China has a very strange and not very sensible taxation system that doesn't provide enough financial resources to invest in a lot of China's needs. So there are major investment needs for rural schooling, to eliminate hukou barriers, household registration barriers, to migrants getting schooling in the cities, to spread the social safety net more equally, to make major investments in old age homes, to combat gender inequality in work and politics. And oops, sorry. He didn't turn my phone on. Sorry. Anyway, so there are all kinds of things that China should, if they had more money, and they had a number of years ago, after they had a changing of the financial system in the mid-90s, they had a lot of money, but now China's the government budget is much more under strain, and there are a lot of things they could do that could produce a more generally developed population that would be of benefit to China's economic progress. But anyway, the taxation system is not redistributive. Andy Walter published an article a couple of years ago in the China Journal that showed that even though the United States is the most unequal advanced capitalist country, our taxation system, even today, is more redistributive than China's. Okay, their taxation system basically does nothing to transfer funds from the rich to the poor. The need for higher retirement ages that I just talked about has been obvious for decades, but it only began in 2025. And my understanding is it's supposed to take place over 15 years. And even then, I think the man was supposed to retire at age 63 and the woman at age 55 for all women, maybe, I don't know. But still, I don't know about you guys, but I didn't retire until I was over 70. So this would be very strange to me. There's also major problems connected to the hukou system, which still, we know that China today has about 2/3 of its population living in cities, but that includes the migrant laborers in the cities who don't have full urban rights and so forth. So at the moment, only about 50% of the total Chinese population has urban hukou. The other 50% has poor rights. Their fringe benefits and so forth are mostly dependent upon the village they came from, even if they've been working in the city for 10, 20 years, whatever. So anyway, so China still has not done very much on a lot of these fronts. So these are my conclusions. China can't avoid long-term population decline. Efforts to boost births will not work or only at the margins. China would do better to improve the welfare and human capital of their overall population, combating gender inequality, reducing family economic insecurity. But so far, the needed reforms are only promised or only timidly starting to be introduced. And it's questioned whether the Chinese Communist Party can avoid having China's unusually rapid aging become a drag on the prospects for realizing Xi Jinping's China dream. So in terms of the first slide, when I said, is this an accomplishment or a looming crisis? I think I'm a little more on the looming crisis side because I don't see China doing enough to have a solution to the demographic trends that it has put in motion, which are not due solely to these mandatory birth limits, but also simply to China's extraordinarily successful economic growth. Okay, but nonetheless, one of the results of that is that China faces very serious problems in the future. So thank you very much.
So kind of lay out what the cause is and the kind of some of the social consequences and the economic costs that go with it. But does that also translate to potential for social instability that their party may be worried about? It's one thing that you have to pay more for elder care, but if those elders start protesting or young people resisting higher taxes, higher retirement ages, is there potential for instability that follows from all this?
Sure. Okay. Well, since my earlier work was about the myth of the social volcano, and even in the more recent survey that you mentioned that was published at the beginning of 2025 using new surveys, people in China are less optimistic, more pessimistic, and so China can't count on people enthusiastically being grateful to the party and so forth. But I guess I still don't. It's not obvious to me how or whether these problems can translate into large-scale political instability that would threaten the Communist Party control, partly because, of course, Xi Jinping has been so extremely diligent in strengthening supervision and control over his population and so forth. So, but I mean, I think there certainly there have even been some. Where was it? A couple of years ago, there was an elder person protest in, I forget, Wuhan or somewhere over some proposal to cut back benefits for older people. So there's certainly potential for China to become a more contentious place and for more people to be willing to complain and protest and so forth. But whether that really will produce any large-scale threat, I don't particularly see that, or I don't know how that would happen.
I'll let you call on.
Oh, okay.
Point shooting.
Steve?
You mentioned the horse here, and that instantly sparked in my mind that this is not just the horse year this year, it's the horse fire year. And whether, there are social dynamics in China, of course, there was a piece in the political economy of Japan about the demographic consequences of horse fire year, and whether, that there's that additional social factor, or whether it's now been broken. So, more of an observation will be interesting to see in 2027 what the demographic fallout, if any, of that superstition is.
Okay.
Is that superstition favor or
Very much against girls.
against girls?
Yeah, for those of you who are not aware of this, There's a 60-year cycle in the Chinese zodiac with 5 solar terms. Yeah, 12 zodiacal terms, and then rotating number of 5, earth, fire, water, etc. And there is a superstition that is certainly prominent in Japan, but also in China, that every 60 years, a horse fire year occurs, and that the girls who are born in a horse fire year will be brilliant, successful, domineering, and utterly unmarriageable. And will completely dominate their husbands. And I'm sure that, what's the problem with that? One of my students, but it just it strikes me just as the dragon year had a demographic bump, whether the horse fire year might have a demographic deficit.
Well, I just learned something new here, right? I knew it was a horse year, and I heard horse fire year, but I didn't know what that meant, on top of horse year.
Mhm.
So I'm agnostic until we see the results of next year. But obviously, I would think that Xi Jinping would be very upset and disappointed that he's been adding all of these. Some of these incentives that I mentioned have been only recently added, like the $500 a year, and the idea that there would be such a sharp drop in the number of births in 2025 compared to 2024, I think must be very discouraging to anybody who thinks that just by manipulating these kinds of incentives and inducements and propaganda that you can somehow reverse the decline in the birth rate. Other questions?
Yeah, thanks for a very interesting talk. I was wondering if you could, with all due respect to the zodiac, I was wondering if you could comment on other sort of comparatively other countries who've worked on population declines, and what are some successes that people would recommend in other countries?
Okay, I mean, other people, including my colleague Mary Brinton, who was a co-author of the book with Ezra Vogel, have done much more on other countries. But I would say some of things. One is there is no advanced industrial country that has above replacement level fertility. They're all below replacement level fertility. But they're all, but some of them, like France and also Scandinavian countries, like the US, have at least, they're not low fertility or ultra low fertility. They're at least closer to two, at least, not to. And so one of the arguments is that the Scandinavian countries in particular, they've done much more for decades to provide subsidized daycare and support for women's rights and other kinds of things. But the United States, our advantage in most periods is that we have, in most periods, had high immigration. So we can tolerate falling fertility rates of our native-born population by filling in the gaps with people we let in. But at the moment, as you know, that there's a rather intolerant set of policies on that front. I would say one other thing that I would point to, which that you don't see in the Chinese experiences so far as I'm aware of them, that is much more the case in Scandinavian countries and even in the US, is there is much more emphasis on what males, husbands and fathers should be doing to bear up more of the load. So the whole onus is on women and providing incentives to women and women, of course, the ones we give birth, but from my point of view, outside of giving birth and nursing, there's nothing about child rearing, and there's nothing else about domestic chores that men cannot do. Okay, and so for instance, there is China's maternity leave, childbirth leave is up to 98 days at a minimum, and some experiences larger. My understanding is for men, it can be up to 30 days, but often is less. It's not mandatory. Well, one of the problems even in Scandinavian countries is that even though they have much more generous paternity leave as well as maternity leave, that many of the men don't take their full paternity leave that's available to them. But there is a considerable amount of research, including a recent paper published by Claudia Golden, the Nobel Prize winning economist from a couple of years ago, arguing that a main thing that can make a difference, but not in terms of going back above replacement level fertility, but in terms of at least staying closer to the 1.7, 1.8 or whatever, is much more involvement by husbands, fathers in relieving the burdens from their lives. And I mean, one of the problems is, of course, you have in our society and in most other societies, you have long-standing patterns in which husbands tend to be a little older in marriage, and they, in the past, had better education and so there was. I used to teach an American family course at Harvard, and what I would ask, and one of the things that was interesting, every time I taught this course, 3/4 of the enrollment was female, only 1/4 male. So what am I doing teaching about the family? This is a woman's field, but I would ask for a show of hands, 3 options. Do you plan to work continuously throughout your life? Do you want to take time off to raise young children and then go back to work? Or do you want to work until you have children and then stay home? And there were very few of these Harvard well-educated women who took this 3rd option, but there were many more that took the 2nd option. So it's still, in the US, it's still, the general assumption is that men don't take time off from their careers to deal with the burden of families. It's only women that do so. And the women do so temporarily, and many of them want to come back to work. But when they come back to work, they're often constrained to take jobs that pay less well, that are less demanding, and so forth. So how you get to a truly gender egalitarian society, you need to somehow figure out a way so that men and women can share equally in the family burdens. It's the family burdens that are really the significant, difference that makes women, have lower incomes, and then therefore that reinforces if the wife has a lower income, then, well, who's going to take time off? Well, she should take time off, because if he took time off, the family's income would suffer. So no society has figured a way to deal with these things very well. But the argument is by Claudia Golden and others that Scandinavian countries, and maybe France, I don't know the French situation as well, have done a much better job of emphasizing policies that try to encourage husbands to do more around the home and lighten the burden on their wives and so forth. In my family, my wife cooks dinner 5 nights a week. I cook dinner 2 nights a week. But she's a much better cook than I am. I wouldn't want to inflict my cooking on her 7 nights a week. David?
Well, fascinating, Marty, subject about which I nothing, but I was listening to the presentation. I kept wondering about provincial variation. All your data was aggregate national data. I was just waiting for a slide that had all 31 provinces' birth rates and how that might vary And in the back of my mind was really what's the relationship between the hukou policy in particular. And if Xi Jinping is not getting much uptake on his various incentives, what if he waved a magic wand and gave a kind of hukou amnesty to the 21%, I think you said, that are already, living in urban areas, presumably on the coast. So what's the correlation, the relationship between the hukou system and this problem?
Well, as I've indicated, I have another paper that talks about the fact that there are studies that show that the surveys within urban areas that included both migrants and permanent hukou, and found that both the number of babies born to the long-term residents was slightly more than the migrants. And they also asked questions like a survey of those that already had one child, do you want to have a second child? And a higher percentage of the long-term permanent population said yes, they might consider having a second child. Urban migrants, if there's also in this other paper, Jonathan Unger did a fascinating study comparing Guangdong cities with Hanoi. And what he found was even though both Vietnam and China have similar kinds of hukou systems on paper, and also similar export-oriented manufacturing and so forth. But for whatever reason, the Vietnamese authorities are much more willing to allow migrants to bring their families and allow their children to enroll in urban public schools in Hanoi, whereas in Guangzhou or Dongguan or Shenzhen, whatever, it's very difficult. And so the contrast between family migration and integrating rural migrants into the city in Hanoi versus sojourning and left behind children cared for by grandparents and visiting your kids on holidays, and it's just night and day. And I mean, I have a whole other paper that's also coming out in China Journal, which deals with these things. Why China they keep claiming they're reforming the hukou system and it's going to disappear and everything, but maybe in the small towns and small cities, maybe that is the case, but I haven't seen any good studies of that. But in large cities, it's still a very tough barrier, and there are even some studies. I don't know if you saw Eli Friedman's study of Beijing, the urbanization of people, but he essentially argues in Beijing, they've actually tightened the restrictions against migrant children proceeding through public schools as a way to induce migrants to leave and make Beijing less crowded with migrants. So the hukou system, a whole different different issue, but in my view, it is related to the population trends, because if you treat people like the migrant laborers are treated in large cities, they're not going to want to or be able to have 2 or 3 children. That's just out of the question.
Yes, for hukou restrict population, if you have a big city hukou, your child cannot go into public school, and your child cannot find a good job and got many social welfare. So immigration, first immigration resident, they just resident, they have no hukou. The child have no hukou. So they worry the future of their child, so they don't want to deliver child.
Didn't hear any of that.
Well, no, we know how the hukou system works, but it's obviously an impediment to childbearing. And if there were an amnesty or something, I don't know. It was just,
But it means that a majority of Chinese young people who don't have urban hukou are systematically disadvantaged in terms of education. So what Scott Rosell, as most of you know, has published these papers about China having a human capital deficit, of having a smaller percentage of its population that has attended high school, upper middle school, if you like, than lots of other developing countries, And what is the reason for that? A lot of it has to do with the fact that for the first 3 decades, at least, of the reform period, official policies essentially encouraged rural young people to get lower middle schooling and no more. And then to become migrant laborers who could work in factories and in construction sites where lower middle school education was enough. But we did not want to open the doors. And we actually have statistics on upper middle school enrollments in China. In 1977, off the top of my head, there were like 17 million upper middle school students enrolled in China. By 1983, there were 6 million. So there was in the early reform era, there was a huge drop in upper middle school enrollments, particularly as rural schools closed down and rural youths left to pursue migrant labor opportunities and so forth. So China, I argue in this paper, which is a different paper than the one I'm doing today, that China benefited enormously in terms of its economic boom. The major engine of China's extraordinary growth for the initial decades was undercompensated rural labor. People were so desperate to leave their villages where they'd been kept in a form of socialist feudalism by Mao for decades, that they were willing to accept very harsh working conditions and very unequal treatment, but still better earnings than they could get if they stayed in the village. And you had these millions and millions of rural migrants streaming into the cities. And I mean, just think about it. I'm preaching on a different subject than I'm talking about today, but think about all of the Chinese high-speed rail lines, the spectacular skyscrapers, the new bridges. And so, who built those? They were not your, urban kid down the street who signed up for those. Those are essentially all migrant laborers who provided the muscle and the energy to do. And of course, they also were the major processors in China's manufacturing boom as the manufacturing capital of the world. So China, I often think about Karl Marx. How would he adapt his theory to deal with the fact that there was this extraordinarily effective exploitation of rural migrant labor? But it wasn't by rich capitalists. It was by urban construction companies and urban factories manufacturing for export and so forth. But nonetheless, China benefited enormously from it, but it produced a long-term historical legacy of a bifurcated population in which the urban, the ability to go to college today, if you're an urban hukou kid, it's like 75% or something, I think. It's very high, but you can't go to college if you don't have upper middle school, if you didn't graduate from upper middle school, and most rural hukou kids until recently have not. And even though they're trying to change that now, they've invested a lot in secondary school education for rural kids, but it's mostly in vocational schools. So they're shunting them not into academic high schools, academic upper middle schools, but into vocational and technical schools. And there's a large literature that says that many of these are newly set up and they have a lot of resources, but they don't do a very good job of teaching. So you may end up with poor math scores when you graduate them when you enter, but but nonetheless, you're at least said to be the equivalent of an upper middle school graduate, but it's in a vocational technical school, not an academic high school. So they're depending upon overwhelmingly on urban hukou kids to provide the, leading young brains to power all these new technology things. Yes,
Sir, thanks for the lecture today. I had a question. One of the bullets you mentioned before said immigration was not a viable option. Is that because the scale of the immigration that would be required to increase the total fertility rate isn't plausible? Or is it based on the country's policies about immigration?
it's both. It's certainly the scale. I mean,
Right.
To the
Yeah.
the idea of,
People, yeah.
China has, what is it, more than three or four times as many people as the US. So, the amount of immigration that we have had in the past, I mean, but it's also the fact, how attractive would China be as a place to go to work if you were
Right.
for some people, yes, okay, but and Japan is, my understanding is Japan is having a little bit of success in increasing immigration, and there's some lines of work in Japan that are increasingly hiring people from Indonesia, the Philippines, or whatever. But having that work in China, I just don't see it, and I think it's also the case that China is not necessarily that welcoming to people coming in and competing for jobs or whatever.
You think it would change though, because you have an aging population that's going to require lower level healthcare, elder care of some sort. And you see other countries will do that. They'll incentivize immigrants coming in to provide those kinds of services.
It's one of the areas that Japan is emphasizing.
Right.
I mean, it's possible China will do some, but it's not going to be on a large enough scale, in my view, to compensate for the very rapid aging of the population and the fact that, so many people are retiring young and younger than they do in other countries, and then what kind of support are they going to have? And again, it's not just financial support, it's that many of them won't have grown children around them to provide that support. I mean, in this survey I did in Baoding in 1994, a typical pattern was a retired couple in their 50s or 60s or whatever, with 3 children nearby. Most of those older people had pensions, so they were not totally dependent financially on their grown children, but they had several children that could alternate coming in by and looking after them and taking them to doctor's appointments and all of those kinds of things. And that's just much more problematic these days. In the back?
Yes. My name is Jinping Chen. I'm a visiting scholar here in the Segal Center, and I have a question concerning China's internal stability and the CCP's regime security. So China's One China policy has contributed not only to the demographic decline, but also to a severe gender imbalance due to the traditional son's preference. So open that. So if Xi Jinping were to initiate a war against Taiwan, let's say, let's example, so many PLA soldiers are often the only sons in their families to face the risk of their life. So that also implies the loss of the family lineage continuity that traditional Chinese society highly value. So to what extent, in your opinion, that could trigger social unrest and internal instability that pose a risk to the regime security of CCP?
Well, you're more expert on the military side of things.
Probably not at all.
David knows about the military side. I don't really see that as a major issue or a major obstacle if China decides it wants to. I think there are other much more important obstacles to China deciding to try to take over Taiwan than just whether people would rebel because their only son is put in harm's way. But I don't know very much at all about military recruitment and all of those kinds of things. I don't, and again, back to my first answer to Bruce, I really don't, I think China in recent years has had bubbling up of discontent and various kinds of protests occurring, but none of them ones so far that the Communist Party is not able to relatively quickly or effectively deal with, or even if they do so in a ham-handed way. I mean, if I think back, I haven't studied the white paper protests of a couple of years ago, but my understanding is afterwards they went out around and rounded up a lot of people who were just there holding up white pieces of paper. They were not doing anything else, but they nonetheless got hassled afterwards and had to explain themselves. And so I think this is a very much more security conscious society than it was before Xi Jinping came to power. So how exactly? I don't think Xi Jinping is all that worried about whether he can maintain control, but I could be wrong. I mean, that would be interesting. Yes, in the back.
On that point, I'll just say for the interest of everyone here that Freedom House has a project called the China Descent Monitor that is like scraping information pretty continuously on protests happening on the local level all across China. So could be good stuff, something good to check out for people who are interested. I have several questions I would like to ask you about your talk, but I will just edit them down to one, which is there anything you're expecting to see out of the 2 sessions this week, in particular on family planning policy?
Good question. Yeah, that's right. The 2 sessions just began, but yesterday, right? Yeah, you don't really know. I haven't followed what's any predictions of what's on the docket, but I mean, I guess I wouldn't be surprised to see some new pro-birth incentives or pro-marriage incentives or things like that. But I don't have anything concrete in mind, and I haven't heard anything about drafts being circulated that would be particularly relevant to this topic.
Thank you, Professor. Very good report. Well, I'm a student in the school.
Can you speak up a little?
I'm a student in the school. And my question is, how do you see the relation between Chinese human rights, beta structure, and decline population, human rights structure? And according to my information, millions Chinese escape from China to Western country, ask refugee, millions. And China restrict religion freedom, but actually religion increase population, like Christianity encourage you believe more case, Islam same, but Chinese religion policy restrict religion freedom actually have a direct relation with decline of population. How do you think Chinese human rights situation related to decline population?
I'm not sure I heard and
Ethan, how do
understood.
you think the human rights relates to
Well,
the decline?
Obviously, China has a very rocky and difficult human rights situation, and it's certainly the case that restrictions on religious organizations and religious worship have increased under Xi Jinping and made it more difficult and so forth. But what that has to do with population, I'm not too sure. I mean, one of the things that's often been remarked is that China, during its mandatory birth limit years, you certainly didn't see a large amount of protests in China based on the idea that abortion is, a basic human rights violation. I mean, abortion was very widely employed and, very brutally employed in some cases and so forth. But there was often an argument that that most Chinese religions don't have as strong opposition to abortion as Christianity does, or at least some versions of Christianity. So, it seems to be peripheral to what I've been talking about today.
Maybe last question back in the corner.
Thank you for your presentation today. You had spoken about rural populations and the hukou system. I'd just be curious your thought about urban populations and say higher education and the academic environment that is so competitive that maybe families have to focus on additional extracurricular activities, programming to be competitive in the academic environment, and what constraint is that on a family when it comes to family planning?
Well, as I refer to this a little in my talk, there's a lot of literature about how competitive it is in China, which is a little strange because China now has a much higher number of college students than it did 15 years ago. But what that has done, in my view, is mainly make it much more important which college you get into. So the intensity of studying to prepare for the Gaokao so you can get into Beida or Tsinghua or whatever, it is very intense. And it's also the case that there are more and more people attending colleges, including new colleges that were set up after the vast expansion of university enrollments after 1998. But many of those students, when they are graduating, find it's difficult to get a job. There was even a few years ago a small literature about what were called ant people. And these were college graduates that couldn't get jobs, and then they were competing with migrant laborers who had lower middle school education and living in shared, hovels or even underground bomb shelters in Beijing or whatever. And so there is very intense competition. And of course, the authorities, one of the things they did to try to respond to this was to, a few years ago, try to ban these after-school tutoring companies. But my understanding is that a lot of those have sprung up again underground or whatever. And families are still trying to find ways to get their son or daughter to get extra out of school preparation so they can do well on the Gaokao. So there are a whole variety of things about China that are more competitive in some ways than in the US. In the US, okay, some people might like to get into Harvard or Yale or University of Michigan or whatever, but there's so many options for. Another thing I didn't mention this in my talk has to do with the fact that in urban China today, it seems to be generally expected that before a man can marry, he should own his own apartment. In China, but before the mid-1990s, fewer than 5% of the urban population in China were homeowners. Almost everybody were renters from their Danways housing or from city housing administration units and so forth. And then in the late 1990s, you had this mass privatization that Zhu Rongji, the premier at the time, engineered that subsidized urban families to be able to get title and reduced mortgages and whatever for the apartments they lived in, and then began buying second apartments and so forth. So now China actually has significantly higher homeownership rates than the US. China, I think there's more than 90% of Chinese families are homeowners. In the US, it's about 67%. But But you don't have to own your home and to get married in the US. I wasn't, I was the homeowner until about 8 years after I got married. My grown son decided to move to Berkeley. It took him more than 20 years to accumulate, able to own his own home in Berkeley. I mean, but people in America, the idea that you have to have title to a home before you can be viewed as marriageable on the marriage market. It makes things much more competitive in China than they are in the US. Okay? We don't require that, I don't think. Were you a homeowner when you got married?
No, my kids aren't either. They both own their own homes, but they're not married.
Oh.
Okay, well, thank all of you for coming out today, especially those of you who are students who are looking forward to spring break and have one last chance for intellectual nourishment here. So please join me in thanking Marty for his talk.